He's very depressed. And I think that the reason that people feel sympathy, or even, it's almost inconceivable, liking for this poor monster, is that they sense that he's not in control of his own life.
It vanished. In the middle of a global rewatch, a major streaming service hit the delete button on Fawlty Towers' most famous episode. But this wasn't about Basil's goose-step. The decision centered on a different set of lines, a quiet conversation in the dining room that suddenly became the most offensive moment in the show's history. Today, we're revealing the specific scene that got the show pulled, the corporate panic that followed, and why, even after being restored, it's still not the same. The case of the missing episode. It wasn't a glitch, it wasn't buffering. One of the most famous, most beloved, most quoted episodes of television ever had been deliberately erased from the server. The episode was The Germans, and it vanished overnight. No warning, no explanation, it was just gone. The media, to put it mildly, went completely wild. The public outcry was deafening. This wasn't some obscure show, this was Fawlty Towers, a program that had been voted by industry experts as the single greatest British television show of all time. This would be like a library deciding to burn Hamlet. The confusion was total. What could possibly be so bad, so toxic, that it needed to be pulled 45 years after it first aired? At first, everyone jumped to the same conclusion. It had to be the goose-step. The episode is world famous for the scene where Basil Fawlty, played by John Cleese, suffers a concussion, loses his filter, and goose-steps around the hotel lobby, mocking Adolf Hitler. Surely, in the sensitive climate of 2020, that was the joke that finally crossed the line. But that wasn't it. And the thing nobody tells you is that the real story is far murkier. The streaming service, UKTV, put out a statement. The problem wasn't Basil's Hitler impression, the problem was a different scene. A quieter, more overlooked moment. The problem, they said, was Major Gowan. In that scene, the Major, a doddering elderly resident of the hotel, is talking to Basil. He uses several extremely offensive old-fashioned slurs to describe a cricket team. The words, which we won't repeat here, are shocking to modern ears. This, the company claimed, was the smoking gun. This was the moment that made the episode unbroadcastable. They weren't just worried about offending people, they were worried about breaking broadcasting rules. The episode was pulled for an immediate review. John Cleese's reaction was, in a word, explosive. He was furious. He went on a media rampage, calling the decision stupid, cowardly, and contemptible. He argued very loudly that the entire point of the Major's character was to show he was an old fossil who was out of touch. The show was making fun of the Major. The joke wasn't with him. The joke was on him. Cleese pointed out that Fawlty Towers was a satire of terrible British attitudes, and you can't satirize something by pretending it doesn't exist. But this is where the first wild theory kicks in. Was the Major really the reason? What many overlooked is that nobody was complaining about the Major. There was no public campaign. There was no social media outrage. This was a decision made by corporate executives, in private, in a panic. Here's the theory. The Major was just an excuse. The thing nobody tells you is that corporations in 2020 were terrified of any controversy. The real problem, the theory goes, was still the goose-step, but the executives knew they couldn't say that. They couldn't say, we are censoring one of the most famous jokes in history because we're afraid of how it looks. But the Major? His lines were indefensible by modern standards. The theory is that the executives used the Major's racist lines as a PR shield. It allowed them to pull the episode and look morally superior and anti-racist, which was a much safer position than looking like they were censoring satire. It was a corporate head fake. The backlash to the ban was 1,000 times louder than any complaint about the episode itself. UKTV was caught in a public relations nightmare they had created. They buckled. Just a few days later, they announced they would be restoring the episode. But there was a catch. It would now come with a guidance warning at the beginning, alerting viewers to the offensive content and outdated language. In effect, the episode was no longer just a comedy. It was now a museum piece, a dangerous artifact that had to be labeled and handled with care. Cleese hated this too, calling it patronizing. The episode was back, but the damage was done. It was now officially the scene that got Fawlty Towers taken off the air, even if only for a weekend. The ordeal had proven that even the perfect comedy wasn't safe. This sudden ban lit a fire, but the episode itself had been a powder keg for decades. The chaos of Room 342. So what is in this episode that makes it so legendary and so dangerous? The Germans is the 6th episode of the first series, and it's a perfect storm of comedic chaos. It's often called the Swiss watch of sitcom plots, where every single piece has to click into place for the final explosion to work. The episode doesn't just start with a problem, it starts with 3 problems at once. First, there's a fire drill. Basil, in his infinite wisdom, decides to make it a bit of a surprise to keep the staff on their toes. This involves him setting off the alarm, running around with a tiny gong, and yelling at guests who are annoyed at the interruption. Of course, in true Fawlty style, the alarm actually catches on fire and Basil has to put it out, setting a wastebasket full of flames right next to a guest. While this is happening, his wife Sybil is in the hospital for a few days for a minor operation. This leaves Basil in charge, a situation that every Fawlty Towers fan knows is a recipe for absolute disaster. Basil thinks he's a great manager, but he's a snob and a bully. Sybil is the only one who can barely control him. And third, during his clumsy attempt to hang a moose head on the wall, Basil gets a concussion. This is the absolute key to the episode. The blow to the head isn't just a gag, it's the permission slip for Basil to lose his last remaining filter. He is medically unhinged, rambling, and barely coherent. This is the setup for the punchline. A group of German guests is scheduled to check in. Basil, in a rare moment of wanting to be polite, gathers his staff, Polly and Manuel, for one simple instruction. Don't mention the war. It's one of the most famous lines in television history. But the thing is, Basil is the only one who can't stop mentioning it. From the second the guests arrive, he's a walking disaster. He asks them if they're here for the water sports and then mutters, "Well, try not to torpedo any." It just gets worse from there, with him constantly bringing up the war while pretending not to. The climax happens in the dining room. Basil, dazed from his concussion and high on painkillers, tries to take their dinner order. When one of the guests is slow to answer, Basil's brain short-circuits. He starts ranting, mocking their accents, and then the big one. He puts a finger over his lip, raises his arm, and does an unmistakable high-kicking goose-step right through the dining room. He shouts about Eva Braun and silly starts and how they bombed his hotel. It is one of the most outrageous, over-the-top, and unbelievably funny bits of physical comedy ever filmed. The German guests are naturally horrified. One of them, a younger man, finally breaks down asking, "How did you ever manage to win?" For years, everyone assumed this was the controversial scene, and to be fair, it's pretty edgy, but what many overlooked is that this scene is actually a massive hit in Germany. When the show was broadcast there, German audiences loved it. They understood the satire. They knew the joke wasn't on them, it was on the stupid, obsessed Brit who couldn't let go of a war that ended 30 years earlier. The joke was on Basil. But that brings us back to the real problem, the scene that actually triggered the 2020 ban. Woven into the same episode is a much quieter, more sinister joke. Basil is talking to Major Gowan, the senile old military man who lives at the hotel. The Major is reading the newspaper and starts telling Basil about an article. He starts using shocking racist slurs to describe a cricket team. He uses the N-word, he uses other horrible terms. Basil, to his credit, looks uncomfortable and tries to change the subject. But the Major just keeps going. This wasn't satire in the same way. Basil's goose-step was punching up at British arrogance and xenophobia. The Major's lines, while in character for a bigoted old fossil, were just raw, unfiltered prejudice. The joke is that he's a buffoon, but the words themselves are vile. And that is what UK TV couldn't handle. They couldn't air those words in 2020. But here's a new detail, part of the Fawlty Towers curse theory. This very same episode is not just famous for its words, but for real physical harm. In a scene, Basil is on the phone and gets frustrated with Manuel. He grabs a frying pan and smacks him on the head. That was a real prop pan, and it hit actor Andrew Sachs. He was badly injured. The Germans episode, it seems, was a vortex of pain, both verbal and physical. But where did these outrageous characters even come from? The answer is shockingly real. Surviving the Glen Eagles. The character of Basil Fawlty wasn't born in a writer's room. He wasn't invented. He was discovered. In 1970, the entire Monty Python comedy troupe was in the seaside town of Torquay to film. They needed a place to stay, and they booked rooms at a hotel called the Glen Eagles. To put it mildly, this was a mistake. The hotel was run by a man named Donald Sinclair. And Donald Sinclair was, by all accounts, the worst hotel manager in human history. He wasn't just rude, he was spectacularly, creatively, almost surgically rude. He was a gaunt man with a military bearing who treated his guests not as customers, but as personal inconveniences. He was a real-life tyrant of terrible service. The Pythons, who made their living from the absurd, couldn't believe what they were seeing. This man was a walking, talking, breathing caricature of misery. The anecdotes from that one single stay became the stuff of legend, passed around by the Pythons for years. Eric Idle, one of the Pythons, left his briefcase in the lobby. When Sinclair found it, he didn't put it in lost and found. He didn't ask who it belonged to. He immediately assumed it was a bomb. He grabbed the case, ran outside, and threw it over a garden wall into the next property. He later explained his paranoia by saying the bag could have been full of bombs. Another time, Terry Gilliam, the American member of the group, was eating dinner. Sinclair stormed over to his table in a rage. The problem? Gilliam was using his knife and fork the wrong way. He was eating, as Sinclair saw it, like a barbaric American holding his fork in one hand to eat. Sinclair physically grabbed the utensils out of his hand and tried to teach him how to eat properly in front of the entire dining room. Michael Palin, another Python, was so morbidly fascinated by Sinclair that he started taking notes, coining the man the most wonderfully rude man I've ever met. But the rest of the crew couldn't stand it. After just one night, the entire Monty Python team checked out. They fled to a different hotel. All of them, except one. John Cleese was obsessed. He saw something in this horribly fascinating man. He convinced his then wife, Connie Booth, to stay on with him. This is not normal behavior. His friends, the funniest people on earth, had fled for their own sanity. Cleese stayed to study the monster. He would just sit in the lobby and watch Sinclair work. He watched him throw a bus timetable at a guest who politely asked when the next bus was. He watched him criticize a guest's car as rubbish. He watched him hide the television set in a back room because he didn't want guests just sitting around and running up the electricity. Sinclair was a bottomless pit of bizarre, paranoid, and snobbish behavior. He was terrified of anyone beneath him and pathetically desperate to impress anyone he thought was high class, failing miserably at both. He was a perfect, tragic, hilarious monster. But here's the wild theory. Why was he like this? The easy answer is he was a jerk. But the thing nobody tells you is that Donald Sinclair was ex-Royal Navy. He served in World War II. The theory is that Sinclair wasn't just rude, he was suffering from severe, undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. Think about it. His paranoia, his obsession with rules and a tight ship, his immediate assumption that an unattended bag was a bomb. That's not a rude response, that's a trauma response. His hostility to invaders in his hotel. What if he was a man so psychologically damaged by the war that he could no longer function in polite society? This reframes the entire origin of Fawlty Towers. It's not just a comedy, it's a comedy built on the foundation of one man's unhealed psychological wound. John Cleese saw a monster and found it funny, but the man who created that monster was a story all his own. Writing in a pressure cooker. Long before he was Basil Fawlty, John Cleese was just John Cheese. That was his family's real last name. His father, an insurance salesman, hated it. He thought Cheese was a ridiculous name, so he had it legally changed to Cleese before John was even born. From the very beginning, Cleese's life was tinged with the absurd. He was also, to put it bluntly, an awkward kid. By the age of 13, he was already over 6 feet tall. His towering, gangly frame made him stick out long before his comedy did. At school, he was smart, but he had a rebellious streak. He was famous for a prank where he painted footprints on the ground, leading from a statue of a famous general to a school bathroom, as if the statue had gotten up and walked away. He was a natural performer, but he was also an intellectual. He went to the prestigious Cambridge University to study law, but law wasn't his destiny. At Cambridge, he joined the Footlights, a famous theater club that was a breeding ground for comedy giants. This is where he met his first major writing partner, Graham Chapman. Together, Cleese and Chapman would go on to become the core of Monty Python. Cleese was always the straight man, the tall, angry figure of authority who would get undone by the chaos around him. It was a role he was born to play. While working in comedy, he met an American actress and writer named Connie Booth. They clicked, got married, and became a creative power couple. After Cleese left Monty Python, they decided to write their own show, based on that horrible hotel manager, Donald Sinclair. This was the birth of Fawlty Towers, but the thing nobody tells you about Fawlty Towers is that it was not fun to make. The writing process was, by Cleese's own admission, unbelievably stressful and awful. This wasn't a happy writer's room, it was just John and Connie, in a room for weeks on end, building the plots. Here's the big wow factor. It took them, on average, 6 weeks to write one 30-minute script. 6 weeks! That's 42 days. For 30 minutes of TV, that's less than a minute of script written per day. This wasn't writing, this was sculpting. They would act out every single line. They would argue over every comma. They would build the plots like a Swiss watch, where every slammed door, every missed message, and every misunderstanding had to be perfectly timed to go off at the exact right second. The Germans episode is a masterclass in this. That kind of farce is the hardest kind of comedy to write. The process was so grueling, so slow, and so painful that it's the only reason there are just 12 episodes of Fawlty Towers in the world. They simply couldn't stand to make any more. The pressure was unbelievable, and it had a cost. What many overlooked is the timeline. Between the first season in 1975 and the second in 1979, John Cleese and Connie Booth got divorced. The show ended their marriage, the pressure cooker exploded. But Mom, they still had a contract for a second season. Imagine that. Showing up to work every day with your ex-spouse, who you just went to court with, to write a show about a miserably married couple who clearly hate each other. The tension is almost unbelievable. This real-life pain, many believe, is what makes the second season so brilliant. The politeness is gone. The barbs between Basil and Sybil are sharper. The desperation is more real. They were writing what they knew. But this leads to another wild theory: the disappearance of Connie Booth. After season 2, Booth, who played Polly, the only sane person in the hotel, vanished. She completely quit acting. She went back to school, and in a move that shocked everyone, she became a professional psychotherapist. For decades, she refused to talk about Fawlty Towers. The theory? She didn't just retire, she escaped. She was the co-creator, co-writer, and co-star. She should have been as famous as Cleese. But she saw what that fame, that kind of obsessive energy, and that toxic environment did to people. She saw the curse firsthand. Becoming a psychotherapist wasn't a random second career, it was a direct response. She had to learn how to heal herself, and then she spent the rest of her life deconstructing the very psychology that Fawlty Towers was built on. She had to flee to save her own sanity. They built a perfect 12-episode masterpiece, but perfection couldn't save them from the modern world. The Curse of the Band episode. Fawlty Towers ended in 1979. It wasn't canceled. It wasn't axed by a nervous studio executive. The show ended quite simply because its creators, John Cleese and Connie Booth, had finally mercifully finished. They had written and they had survived 12 perfect episodes, 12 capsules of pure, compressed, comedic chaos. In an industry built on running a good idea into the ground, they created a masterpiece, dropped the mic, and walked away. The show was, and still is, considered by many to be the single greatest British sitcom of all time. It's an untouchable monument. But the legacy of the show and the impossible pressure of its perfection followed the cast forever. It clung to them. And this is where the dark, chilling theory of the curse of Fawlty Towers really takes shape. Because that kind of perfection, it turns out, demands a price. Think about what was paid. We all know the most famous story. It destroyed the marriage of its creators. John Cleese and Connie Booth were married when they started writing it, inspired by a real-life encounter with a comically rude hotelier. But the pressure of creating the show was unimaginable. They weren't just writing about a dysfunctional hotel. They were living in one. They spent months locked in a room, arguing, refining, and building the intricate clockwork plots. The stress was so immense, the lines between their real-life arguments and the scripted arguments of Basil and Sybil began to blur. By the time the second season aired, their marriage was over. The show, it seems, was the first victim. But what about the rest of the cast? What price did they pay for being part of a legend? Let's start with Andrew Sachs, the man who played the lovable, confused waiter from Barcelona, Manuel. On screen, Manuel was the show's physical punching bag, the target of Basil's endless, explosive rage. But the violence, it turns out, wasn't always fake. This was the 1970s. Health and safety standards were different. The priority was the laugh at any cost. In the famous episode The Germans, Basil, in a fit of rage, is supposed to hit Manuel with a frying pan. John Cleese, a perfectionist, insisted that the foam prop pan didn't look real enough. He grabbed a real heavy-duty pan and brought it down on Sax's head. The actor was injured, but the take was used. That wasn't even the worst of it. In another episode, The Kipper and the Corpse, a fire gag went horribly, horribly wrong. The script called for smoke to pour from a room. The special effects team decided to use a chemical smoke mixture. This wasn't harmless fog. It was a chemical compound that, it turns out, was highly corrosive. The smoke badly burned Andrew Sachs' arms. He was paid over 700 pounds in damages for the incident. He was physically, permanently scarred by the show. Then there's Connie Booth herself. She played Polly, the sensible, long-suffering waitress who often tried to clean up Basil's messes. She was the co-creator, the co-writer, and the heart of the show. And what happened after Fawlty Towers? She quit. She didn't just move on to other projects, she left the industry almost entirely. She walked away from the fame, from the spotlight, and from the pressure of that perfect creation. She became a psychotherapist. Think about that. The show was so intense, so chaotic, it drove its own co-creator to dedicate the rest of her life to treating other people's trauma. She went from performing chaos to healing it. And in a final tragic irony, we look at the two main supporting actors, Andrew Sachs and Prunella Scales, the brilliant actress who played Basil's wife, Sybil. Sybil Fawlty was the real boss of the hotel. Her shrill machine gun laugh, her perfectly coiffed hair, her constant nagging presence. She was the immovable object to Basil's unstoppable, furious force. Her performance was famous for its precision. Every word, every glance was razor sharp. Both Andrew Sachs and Prunella Scales spent their final years battling dementia. Think about that for a second. A show that was famous for its intricate, razor-sharp scripts. A comedy built on perfect timing, on complex, overlapping dialogue, on feats of memorized, fast-paced farce. And its two main supporting actors both succumbed to a disease that steals your memory. A disease that erases the script. It's a heartbreaking, chilling coincidence. Even the hotel itself is cursed. The real Glen Eagles Hotel in Torquay, the one that gave John Cleese the inspiration for Basil Fawlty, it's gone. For decades, it limped on, a sad tourist trap, haunted by the ghost of a fictional character. It was finally demolished in 2015. It wasn't preserved as a landmark. It was wiped off the map. And what stands in its place today? A retirement home. The ultimate symbol of chaos being paved over by quiet, sterile order. The show, it seems, was so perfect, so intense, it was like lightning in a bottle. But the lightning was too strong. It burned the bottle and everyone who touched it. The marriage, the actor's health, the building itself, all of it was consumed by the show's chaotic energy. This brings us to today. The banned episode, The Germans, is now back on streaming services. But it comes with a new accessory, a little warning label at the beginning alerting viewers to outdated language and discriminatory content. It's a tiny digital reminder that the world that created Fawlty Towers is gone. The world has changed. But John Cleese hasn't. In 2023, he announced the unthinkable, the one thing fans have dreaded for 45 years. He is bringing Fawlty Towers back. A reboot is in the works, set for release in 2024. But this is where it gets weird and where the mystery deepens. The new show is about Basil Fawlty, now in his 80s, running a new small hotel in the Caribbean. And he's running it with a daughter he just discovered he had. Let that sink in. Connie Booth is not involved. Prunella Scales and Andrew Sachs have passed away. It's just Cleese, the The setting is changed, the cast is gone, the entire context is erased. This is the big question, the mystery at the heart of the show's legacy. How can this possibly work? How can a character like Basil Fawlty, a man whose entire comedy is based on being rude, snobbish, class-obsessed, xenophobic, and permanently out of touch, exist in the 21st century? Basil's humor was a release valve for a very specific post-war British anxiety. He was a man who felt the world was leaving him behind, that his social status was collapsing, and he took it out on everyone he saw as beneath him. That character presented today isn't a lovable curmudgeon. He's a monster. And this leads to the final, wildest theory of all. The reboot is a trap. John Cleese, in recent years, has become famous for one other thing: his intense public hatred of woke culture. He talks about it all the time. He complains that comedy is dead, that you can't say anything anymore, that cancel culture has destroyed creativity. He knows this show with this character cannot possibly be made today. He knows the media and the modern audience will tear it apart. So the theory is he's not trying to make a good show, he's making a statement. He is deliberately and brilliantly setting a woke trap for his critics. He wants it to be canceled. He wants the outrage. He wants the bad reviews and the angry online articles. Why? So he can go on a victory tour. So he can hold up the canceled reboot as proof of everything he's been saying. So he can claim he proved once and for all that comedy is dead and that the woke mob has no sense of humor. The reboot isn't a show, it's the ultimate satirical prank with the entire media as his target. He is weaponizing his own legacy. People watching this are wondering, oh, is this true? Could he really be that cynical? The thing is, the very culture that banned his most famous episode, or at least put a warning label on it, is the culture he's now trying to sell a new show to. Is it a genuine attempt to revive a beloved character, or is it the most elaborate, most expensive, most bitter "I told you so" in comedy history? The original episode wasn't taken off the air permanently, but its freedom was. The freedom to be offensive, to be dangerous, and most importantly, to trust the audience to understand who the butt of the joke really was. We were trusted to know that Basil, not his victims, was the fool. That trust, it seems, is gone. And that's the real story. Now John Cleese is about to find out if you can build a new hotel on the ruins of a cursed legacy, or if, like the original, it's destined to be demolished. So, was the ban a fair correction for language that has no place on TV, or was it the start of comedy's end? Let us know what you think. Hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden stories.